Peace, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Real Talk podcast with Tehran and Roxana. Today, we're honored to introduce our esteemed guests, Professor Bart D. Ehrman and Dr. Javed T. Hashmi. They'll be leading an upcoming course looking into the historical challenges within two of the world's most influential religious texts, the Bible and the Qur'an. The topics covered in these courses hold much promise, offering insights into pressing questions surrounding these texts, such as the Quran's origins and its preservation over time, methods historians employ to discern fact from fiction in the Gospels, whether Quranic stories lean towards historical accuracy or contain elements of myth and legend, and the extent to which both the Bible and the Quran may be implicated in fostering intolerance, hatred, and violence. If this piques your interest, you can find a link in the description for more information and to sign up for the courses with Ehrman and Hashmi. We extend our gratitude to these two gentlemen for taking the time out of their busy schedules to discuss their upcoming project with us. Welcome to our platform, gentlemen.
Well, thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
One of the initial questions that we wanted to ask you was that the very title of your course, the Bible and the Quran, comparing the historical problems, provokes some controversy. What was the thinking behind that title, and in particular, what type of students do you hope to attract with it?
I think we kind of meant it to be descriptive rather than being offensive to anybody. We both of us approach our texts from a historical point of view, as opposed to a religious point of view. I started out as a believing Christian who did understand the Bible to be inspired, but over the years I came to a different view. But even when I was a Christian, I studied it historically. And I came to realize that there are problems with knowing what the authors originally wrote. In the New Testament, sometimes it's hard to know what the authors wrote because our manuscripts are different from each other in places. And the contradictions make it impossible to know sometimes what actually happened. And so there are historical problems. And so that's long been known for the New Testament. People since the 18th century have known that about the New Testament. My sense is, and Javad's the expert on this, but my sense is that it's a more recent development within Islamic studies and with the Quran, but there are analogous issues. And so our question is, how do these two texts, as Tehran said, Islam and Christianity are the two largest religions in the world. Half the world's population is one or the other. And so these are their sacred texts. And so it's useful to look at these texts as historians as well as believers, for people who want to do that, but to understand them historically and then understand them in relationship to each other.
Yeah, from my side, as far as the title is concerned, we went back and forth on the title. I was trying to go with something fancy, like unveiling and then Bart said, rightfully, I think, let's just make it descriptive so that people know what they're signing up for. And I think he's absolutely right and the expert when it comes to that. So that's why we went with that. Now, personally, I didn't have a problem with the title, and I don't think even traditional Muslims should have a problem with the title. These are problems. If you look at even the traditional Islamic literature, they would call it problems, contradictions. Like when it comes to hadith, what do we do if there's contradictions? And so I don't think anyone can deny that there are problems. You may have different answers. You may say the Quran has all of the answers and it's rock solid and no issue, but we should at least first of all identify the problems. And the point of the course is, whether you agree with me or you adamantly disagree with me, I'm just going to give an overview of the field, really. And I think even traditionalist Muslims should accurately understand that before they come up with their counter responses. And right now what's happening is, in the public sphere, it's kind of a warped impression that they're getting, one through kind of Islamic apologia on the one side and then anti-Islamic polemics on the other. And so this is just trying to go straight down the middle from an academic approach. What you would learn at a place like Harvard or Yale, that's what we're trying to put out, right? At least from my perspective.
Yeah, and I think the traditional Muslim scholarship, or the ones that have any pushback to the course, should at least appreciate that you are laying out these problems on the table, because a lot of people might not be aware or have been exposed to such problems, and puts us in a position to where they can grapple with it.
And in terms of that sort of historical critical method that you're discussing, how would you compare the stage of Quranic studies to that of biblical studies? How do you envision this developing in the future in particular?
Well, I think the comparative question is going to be really interesting, and it's going to be impossible to answer until I hear what Javad has to say about the Quran, because I'm not a Quran expert, and he's not. He probably knows a lot more about the New Testament because it's more kind of in the environment, the critical approach to the New Testament than a critical approach to the Quran. But the kinds of scholarship that I apply to the New Testament has been around for a long time. I mean, it's probably since the 19th century, there have been scholars, especially in Europe, but now, in America as well, that have taken this kind of historical approach. Most of these scholars are believing Christians. I myself am not a Christian, but it makes me a kind of a strange bird in the field. There aren't too many people like me who are not Christian who study the New Testament so intensely, but many people who do study intensely do have the same kinds of assumptions and things I do. And I think Javad's exactly right that the kinds of things we both talk about are things that you would simply learn at an institution of higher education that's approaching things historically, and in any major university in the United States, at least. And so,
yeah, thanks so much. So if I know anything about the New Testament, it's in no small part due to Bart Ehrman, who I've listened to several hours of it till his voice is in my head, and also reading his many books. And I think that's the case for many people in Quranic studies whose first entry point into biblical studies, because there's a point in your career where when you're studying in Quranic studies where you realize, oh, I can't just ignore this, what's going on in biblical studies completely. And that was difficult for me because I was like, I'm already overwhelmed with everything in Quranic studies. And now you want me to study. My advisor was like, you should really start studying this stuff. And but that was one of my entry points. So thank you for that. I forgot the question was, what stage is Quranic studies at? In a previous interview, I said it's in its infancy. I think that's unfair. It's probably now in its preteen awkward phase, but it's definitely behind when it comes to biblical studies, but that's just because of chronology. It just started later. And I think the key point that Bart mentioned is that many of the people, and I think he said most, who are in the field have some faith commitments. So it's not this kind of atheistic, anti-theist assault on faith necessarily. Many of the pioneers of historical critical scholarship were believing and professing Christians and Jews. And now some Muslims are in the field now as well. And yes, I do think it's hard to retain all of your orthodox traditionalist beliefs, but I don't think faith is completely demolished either, necessarily, at least.
Okay. In modern scholarship of the Quran, there appears to be a shift away from using terms such as borrowing when discussing stories within the Quran that bear similarities to those found in the Bible and extra biblical literature. Instead, the Quran is seen as intertextually engaging with these stories. How does this shift in perspective impact our understanding of the Quran's relationship with earlier narratives?
Javad, that's for you.
Oh, yeah, I was about to say,
yeah. No,
I
that's
guess
okay.
I would aim towards you.
Yeah, well, I think Tehran. So, Tehran, am I saying your name correctly?
Yes.
Tehran. Okay. And my name is Javad, by the way, not Javed. But that's all right. I'm going to mess up your name in this, so it's okay. Yeah, well, what I was going to say is that Mr. Poole is much more educated than the average person out there. Same with Roxana when it comes to Quranic studies. So you're absolutely right. In the academic space now, we've moved away from simply saying that the Quran borrows from the Bible, borrows from XYZ, and always seeing the text as derivative. That was the trend early on in Quranic studies, but it's shifted dramatically. And now we're starting to realize how the Quran creatively rearticulates what it finds in other texts and how it engages those texts. And that's something that still hasn't made its way out in the public. So that's what I'm hoping this course will help to do. Because on the one side, you have the Islamic traditionalists who want to deny any sources of inspiration on the text because God can't have sources, right? So it has to come from the sky. But then when you see, okay, well, you can kind of trace where this story comes from and how the Quran engages with it. And then on the other hand, you have the anti-Islam polemicists, including many Christian apologists, who will say, aha, see, it's just borrowing from here and it's made up and Muhammad messed it up. I think it's a lot more complex and nuanced than that. And for me, I think the greatest part is to see how the Quran creative re-articulates things. And that's kind of what I find fascinating about the Quranic text.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. And there's probably no story within the Quran in which you described, such as the Alexander narrative or the Dul Qarnayn narrative in relation to what possibly seems like Alexander legends. But not to move too sideways. In terms of the intertextual relationship that the Quran has with the Bible, how important is it for students of the Quran to have a grounding in biblical studies?
Well,
I think that's. Oh, go ahead.
let me say, as the biblical scholar, it's extremely important, and they ought to study the Bible more, and and buy more books and listen to more courses. That's my view.
I think it's absolutely essential, and I think as we go forward, it's going to be incorporated into the field more and more, and that's why I think this course is, pretty groundbreaking from that standpoint. And I think there should be more courses like that. Like there wasn't a single course at Harvard which took a historical critical approach to the Bible and the Quran in a comparative way, and so I think that's something really exciting. But again, I'm just tooting our own horn here.
No, I mean, no, even before I became aware of your course, it totally enriched my understanding of the Quran by looking at it intertextually, dealing with other narratives outside of the Quran, such as what you might find in the Bible, the Torah, and other books that were in circulation. Yeah, for myself, and I believe other people who participate in your course, it will do the same for them when they see how these two texts interplay with each other. But another hot topic concerning the Quran, which seems to be garnering significant interest even beyond academia, is how we should interpret the stories found within it. Should we regard them as literal and factual history, or should we view them in a more allegorical sense, aiming to teach religious truths rather than historical ones? In your course, do you propose a methodology for understanding this?
So I think this one's again for me. Tehran, I think you answered the question yourself. I think it's going to be very problematic for Muslims to take. Unfortunately, modern Muslims do take the text very, very literally, historically factual, scientifically factual, and we're going to see what the problems are when you take that approach in the course. So yes, my own personal viewpoint is that we should understand the Quran uses these stories for hortatory or moral purposes, religious. It's basically called what I call theologizing narrative. So the Quran is engaging with these stories to make a theological point. That's how I take it.
Well, this question was actually aimed for both of you. Just Bart, Professor Ehrman.
No, Bart's fine. Bart's fine. Yeah.
Okay, Bart, coming from your background in biblical studies, how did Christians also deal with the stories and narratives within the Bible? Was it hard for them to come to terms with seeing them as literal or factual history, or can we also see the stories in the Bible as some kind of history of some sort, or where is biblical studies at with this as well?
Yeah. My sense is that most biblical scholars would not pose it as an either or, that it's either historical or some kind of metaphorical parable or something like that. That most stories, many stories in the Bible have some kind of historical basis to them. And one very interesting question that we can ask of a text like that is, what can we establish as historical, as something that actually happened? So that's a historical question. You read a story about Jesus and you figure out what actually happened here in reality. Another approach to the same story is a literary approach, where you try to understand what the author is trying to accomplish by telling the story in the way that he tells it. Mm-hmm. And when you come to the Bible, for example, I'm sure it's this way with the Quran as well, with that question, then you come up with some also religious perspectives, that the author is trying to emphasize this particular religious truth, and that's why he's telling the story. Sometimes authors change historical data in order to make theological points. And so that's significant. It's not saying something negative about the author. It's saying that he had a historical basis, and we should try and figure that out. But also, he saw that this theological issue was really important, and so it gives you food for thought when you approach it that way. If you don't approach it that way, then basically you're just saying, he's no good for history. I'm not even going to read the thing. It's like that's crazy. These are texts that are really important, and they're important in part because they help us think about ultimate issues, about big problems in our world and problems of existence and what it means for us to be here. And it'd be crazy to throw it out because, well, that didn't happen. So that's my view of the Bible anyway.
Can I give an example of what Bart was just saying, that a author will adjust or modify history to make a theological point? So an example of that is Nikolai Sinai has written an article where on his reading, and I think I agree with him, it seems that the Qur'an is saying that the Exodus, it wasn't that the Hebrews or the Israelites conquered the Palestine, but rather they end up conquering Egypt, where the Pharaoh and his people are. And now a Christian apologist who takes a very fundamentalist approach will see, this is a historical error on the part of Muhammad. But I mean, historians doubt whether the Exodus even happened. So this is not a great point, in my opinion. What the Quran is doing is re-articulating the history in such a way so it matches up typologically for the Prophet Muhammad, where the idea is that the meek inherit the earth, and they inherit what the oppressors and the persecutors are. They're going to be defeated by God, and then they're going to inherit that. And so that's what the Quran is doing by re-articulating the story of Exodus in that way.
And I wonder if the Quran is also doing it for the stories that are more recent to Muhammad's time, such as what the classical commentators would refer to as Surah Baruj and also Surah Al-Fil. If it's also doing the same thing, because sometimes we might exclude those stories when we think of their use in an allegorical sense. Maybe they don't, but I have. So I'm not going to throw other people under the bus in that sense.
I would just, I'm not saying that we take it as allegory, by the way. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is taking it as stories that have a moralizing purpose, and they are based in historical events, but they are re-articulated and reimagined in a creative way. So I think pre-modern people had a very different understanding of history. It's not what actually happened as we think now, but it's a much more creative aspect to it for a moralizing purpose. So for example, you had historians, pre-modern historians, who would write entire dialogues of what happened on a battlefield. Did they really think that this is exactly what was said? Probably not. But they're doing it because that's, for them, it's kind of conveying the truth in this kind of creative way, I would say.
In terms of using text to sort of try and uncover history, but do you believe that the criteria developed by the Quest for the Historical Jesus Project were effective at identifying accurate data about Jesus and his life as preserved in the Gospels?
I think they can do. And I think the big problem is that when people talk about the criteria for the historical Jesus, they have in mind these kind of discrete categories, and you give them names: multiple attestation and the criterion of dissimilarity. A lot of people hearing this won't even know what these are, but it sounds like you're like inventing stuff to come up with something historical about Jesus. In fact, the criteria that scholars use to establish what happened in the life of Jesus is the same criteria they use for anybody living in the past. Just New Testament scholars have given them these labels, but everybody who's trying to figure out, what somebody did in the past, they try to figure out what the sources are. They try to figure out if the sources are reliable. They see if some of the sources are independent of each other, so they're not dependent. They're not getting the stories from each other. They're trying to see if independent sources all say the same thing. That would be useful. They try to look at the sources. Are the sources just saying things that they themselves believe, or there's some things in them that seem to cut against what they think? In which case, well, that's probably more likely historical. And so it's the same thing you do for anybody. It's just New Testament scholars have kind of reified these things and made them these entities. And so some people object to them on those grounds. But my view is that you approach understanding Jesus using these sources the way you would approach understanding Romulus, using sources that describe things that he did, or Apollonius of Tyana, another miracle worker from the 1st century. If you want to know something about the historical Apollonius, your sources have religious stuff in them. And so you have to figure out how to deal with these historically. And I think it's the same criteria.
All right. Well, thank you for your time and joining us on our platform. And we received so many questions from our viewership that unfortunately we weren't able to squeeze in, as well as questions that we pinned down that we weren't able to squeeze in. But in particular, on how believers in both Christianity and Islam can approach historical critical work on their respective faiths in a way that enriches and broadens their understanding of their faith, instead of viewing it as a potential threat to their beliefs or a means of delegitimizing the divine nature of their scriptures. For those interested in the answers to those questions, we would recommend signing up for the course, as Professor Ehrman and Dr. Hashmi will be covering this in a section about about combining faith and scholarship. Thank you two gentlemen, and I wish much success for your course, and I hope to check it out for myself.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.